I wanted to give living proof, as it were, through these stories, that if you bring a certain quality of attention to someone's inner world, what you actually find beyond the surface labels is a world of hidden wonders. Is a psychological realm, if you like, that's intelligent, creative, compassionate, and vital, life-giving. And so in a way I really want the book to change this notion that the unconscious is this dark, scary place that you only go to if you really must.
Yes.
And begin to see that there is something really wonderful about this journey inward.
Yes, and then what struck me about the emphasis of that point that you've just made is that it's not just all about the history. It's about finding those green shoots, as you call them, for the future. So it's like digging through and finding the light and the health and the positivity and giving it space to develop.
Exactly.
Which you don't hear in psychobabble.
No.
If that's a word I can use.
You can certainly use it, absolutely. I'm really hoping that that's one of the things that this book will relieve everybody of, the psychobabble.
And you get that with patients saying, "Oh, I've it's all to do with my childhood. It's also to do with abandonment," and they can't. It's like that suffocates any of the light coming through, which is what I loved about the book, and what really struck me as very different from any other book that I've read.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a key point you're making, because most people come to therapy because there's something troubling them. There's a disturbance of some kind, either a sort of nameless disturbance, a sort of generalised feeling of anxiety or something, or something has actually happened in their outside life, a bereavement or a marriage difficulty or something. So the starting point for all therapy is disturbance. Now, most of the traditional psychological world tends to view disturbance as a sign that something's gone wrong, or that something that has gone wrong in the past is haunting you, coming back to haunt you, as it were. Whereas I take a different view, which is that often the disturbance is a bit like the disturbance in the ground when something brand new is trying to come through. An aspect of yourself that has been hidden from your sight up till this point, that wants to come into view in order to make you more authentic, more vital, more whole. So my job as a therapist is a bit like being a gardener, really. I mean, I've just been out yesterday in my garden, really gently, using my fingers, clearing away the leaves, the brown leaves that were all over the soil. And every time I did that, I would, behind the leaves, I'd find these tiny little shoots. And as a therapist, I have to become really sensitive, because these little shoots are not easy to see. They're quite hidden by definition, they're quite hidden. And so I sort of see myself as someone, my main job is not to know things about someone, but to be sensitive so that I can find these little things. Because, for example, there are lots of examples in the book, but these little hidden shoots can give themselves away. And very often clients say to me, they use the word weird a lot, which I love that word, weird. They'll say, I had a weird dream last night, or something weird happened at work this week. And whenever a client says that, I go, there's a disturbance, if you like, something doesn't add up, and I'm always interested in that. It's like a little crack in the surface story. But it can equally happen in a therapy session when someone suddenly breaks eye contact, or there's a sudden change of voice, tone, or a sudden flush of the face. It's almost if there's a part that knows that's keeping something from the rest of you, and it gets given away in these little flashpoints of emergence. And my job is both to catch these moments and then to give them space to be able to grow into what they're meant to be.
Quite brilliant, actually. Quite brilliant.
Well, it's very thrilling. It's very thrilling.
And that, and what you've described is also where all through the book is the theme of nature.
Yeah.
And your clear love of nature, and also combined with your clear love of photography. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit more. You've done it very nicely in that illustration of how those have helped you formulate your stories and talk about how you work and how you think.
Brilliant. Yes, nature was my first teacher, really. I think I've almost would say I've learned more about how to see a human being from my early experiences of observing nature, of walking in a natural landscape. I lived in rural Wiltshire, and we were quite free to roam as a child. And one of the things I learned very early on is that the more you look, the more you see. It sounds like an obvious thing, but actually the inverse is also true. The more cursory you glance, the less you actually see. So one of the first lessons from nature is this idea that extending observation in time, what I call beholding, is really fundamental to seeing more of what's actually there in a person. And then the other thing about walking in nature is that when you walk through a landscape, you might turn a corner and suddenly discover there's something around that corner, or you go over the brow of a hill and a whole new vista comes up. And this idea of the inner landscape has been really important to me. And I
the inner landscape of your patient.
Of my patient.
Of your patient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, I tell the story of Ralph, who was a very burnt out music executive who came to therapy because he was not sleeping well and he was beginning to have physical signs of being unwell. And he came to therapy asking to be more resilient. He said, I need to learn to be more resilient. And the image that came up for both of us not long into the therapy was the image of a coral reef in waters that are getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And we know from nature that coral reefs can withstand a little bit of heat, but they have a limit. And if the water stays hot for too long, they begin to bleach and to crack, and sadly that is in fact exactly what's happening. And the trouble with Ralph's problem was not that he wasn't resilient enough, it was just that he'd been in hot water for too long, and his work environment was just far too demanding and pressurized, and what needed to change was not him, his resilience, but he did need to make some changes in his environment. And I'll just give one other example of landscape, which is the very second story in the book, which is a story about Jake. Jake, as a very young child, was sent to boarding school and learnt very early on, I think the very first night, that it was not safe to cry, because if you cried, you would be humiliated. And so he packed away all of his emotional life deep down inside him, and being in the room with him, he was very flat and very dry and very lacking in vitality. And the image, and he came from the Lake District, and the image I very quickly formulated of him was of it being a dry river valley, a dried up river valley, where once all the vitality and flow of water, when he was a young child, before he went to school, it had flown very naturally, but it had all dried up. And then the moment, this is one of these moments in the story, is when after several months of this flatness, of just being patiently waiting with this flatness, he brought in a story from something that had happened during the week to a friend of his, and he cried. And his crying wasn't excessive, it was more like his eyes shone with tears, like pebbles in a stream. But it was his ability to trust that it was safe to cry with me. It was like a dam breaking and his river valley filled up again with water. So all of these images from nature give us such a much more vital and particular sense of someone's inner life that putting labels on just doesn't do.
No.
So that's a long answer to your question. I'll say a bit about the photography as well, if that would be helpful. Or
I think it is quite interesting, actually. I found it very interesting because you've mentioned the fact that you you need to observe people over time, and you can't make snapshot diagnosis or cure. You know, snapshots, they're just unrealistic, but somehow our Western culture seems to embrace that that is the way forward, where your book says very much that's not the way forward, which is one of the reasons why I loved it, because that's how I believe in my therapeutic practice. But so you've mentioned the dimension of time, but you haven't talked about breadth of vision or focus, which I thought was very interesting, and that's where you brought your photography in.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to bring photography into the book. It sort of crept in, and I'm so glad it did, because in a way what I discovered whilst writing the book is that you need two different aspects to see someone in all of their richness and significance. You need an aspect or a dimension where you open, and that's a bit like the aperture of a camera, and you open in order to see the full picture, to see it from lots of different points of view, and to see it with your heart as well as your mind. And that takes time, because to see someone with your heart, you have to start caring about them.
That must be.
Yeah, and to start caring about them, you have to be really curious about their particularity. We care about the particular, we don't care about the general. If someone is a type of person, a person with depression, it's not the same as seeing the intricate particularity of how someone behaves and how life moves through them. So seeing with the heart as well as the head, and that takes time. And also seeing's a magical thing, because if you see someone over time, they feel seen.
Very important.
Very seen, very important, because where someone really feels seen, they will show you more. It's this wonderful co-created process, seeing. It's not that there's an objective truth out there that I'm looking at. It's my client's experience of being seen acts as a sort of gravitational field that allows hidden things like the tears that Jake had hidden to resurface, because it suddenly feels as if you're held with care and with genuine, patient, faithful, these are all words I use in the book, vision.
And also presumably because they haven't seen it themselves either, perhaps.
No.
So you help them see them. It's not just what you see, it's what you see together.
It absolutely is. And I think I say somewhere in the book that a lot of people think therapy is about being seen, which it is to one degree, but it's also about learning how to see. You know, so I would hope that somebody would finish therapy knowing how to do this for themselves.